and welcome back to another episode of the EMS Handoff Podcast. I'm David, along with my co-host, Bradley.dean, who's continuing his run through anybody that would talk to him at the North Carolina EMS Expo. We've got another great episode coming today. So Bradley.dean, the infamous, one of a kind, and in his wonderful threads today, man, you're kicking it today. I kind of like that.
Well, I didn't have a pair of red pants to match Rob's red pants, so I had to wear kind of a red shirt.
But sitting down, of course, is not good for red pants because you can't see them, but we'll cover that later.
And you know, may get some outtakes of this, but you know, normally you don't, you know, when we went to recording online, you don't always record what's down below the video lines. So, but before we get started, we want to thank our podcast partner, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. They have been an industry leader for many years, but we are going to take it on to us. We are your source for all things EMS in the podcast verse. But today we've got competing podcasts. So Bradley.dean, introduce our guest and tell us who you got with you.
So today we've got Rob Lawrence. I want to let him kind of introduce himself, and he's got a podcast that he runs on another platform that hopefully we're going to put this on both.
Hopefully we'll do some crossover. Hello, I'm Rob Lawrence, and actually I am the voice of EMS1's EMS1 Stop. I'm also the voice of the NAEMT Radio podcast for NAEMT members, and also with my home company Prodigy, we produce the EMS Educator podcast. So basically you won't get me off your airwaves.
Hey, it's great. You came to us from across the pond, and then, you know, worked in Virginia for a while. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I started off as a career Army officer, first of all, and then did that for 20 years. I was in the medical services and then left and joined the National Health Service in the UK. And I was the Chief Operating Officer of the East of England Ambulance Service and did that, enjoyed that. And then the call came to Richmond, Virginia, and I emigrated lock, stock and barrel to Richmond, Virginia, was there for 10 years. Then moved across to Alameda County, California. And for those that don't know their California geography, Alameda is everything to the east of San Francisco, across the bay, the city of Oakland. And then I tried to retire badly, gave up one job, now have six, and work with Prodigy EMS, sort of my half-time job. And also I'm the executive director of the California Ambulance Association and frustrated journalist and podcaster.
So what better than to add another podcast in your line? You know, you're retired, so you have plenty of time in that schedule.
Right. And this is another one I can add to my checklist of podcast guest spots. So thank you for inviting me along.
Absolutely.
All right. So this morning you did a presentation, talking about lots of challenges and things that face EMS. And, so let's take a minute. Let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Well, there's many elephants in the room. And I came up with 10 things that we probably all know about, which we need to think about, and occasionally we need to act upon. And so really it was an hour's worth of hopefully thought-provoking topics and things that just are challenging us as an industry, as a profession, from everything from politics to education through to just dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic.
Yeah, so that presentation brought up a lot of things for people to think about. Everything from looking at recruiting, retention, all of that. So what are some of the services that you worked with, doing right now with some of that?
Well, my first elephant in the room, if you remember, was actually talking about the revolving door that is recruiting and retention. And the pandemic has been a challenge for us all because a lot of volunteer rescue squads stopped volunteering. A lot of people literally had their lot with the pandemic and stopped doing EMS. We lost a lot of people through that sort of attrition. We lost a lot of people. We didn't gain a lot of people because, of course, we couldn't train and educate them and bring them in. So the pipeline kind of dried up for a bit. And then, of course, there comes back down to during the pandemic, what else happened? Everybody else raised their salaries, raised their income, raised their wages, and we couldn't compete. And so therein lies a challenge of just getting people and keeping people. back in the old days, I would talk about, how big is your budget, how big is your recruiting budget versus how big is your retention budget? And I would argue that recruiting budgets were much bigger than retention budgets. And there is go away and think about that for a second. And so there's lots of challenges. I went out to look at the wider world, and as part of my discussion was just to talk to leaders really about how we can fix that. And I looked at the Glassdoor this year, the top 50 Glassdoor companies, and looked at their the description of their sort of citations, if you like. And not one of them mentioned pay and benefits, but all of them mentioned the ethos, the teamwork, the leadership. And so my takeaway and my elephant, if you like, was the fact that we have to think about that and work hard on creating the environment in which people are going to want to stay and going to want to thrive. Sometimes it's not necessarily the pay, but it's actually the people. And so we have to work on that. And that was my sort of opening gambit, if you like.
Yeah. So, for recruiting and retention, yes, we have to work on the people. And in order to recruit, in order to retain people, we've got to have funds to be able to do that. So one of the other big elephants is reimbursement.
Yeah. And we're in and I contended all the way through the session that EMS is in a pickle, right? And we're in the pickle because we need to pay people a living wage. We need to be able to reimburse people for the work that they do, the knowledge that they have, and the service that they deliver. However, as we all know in EMS, we only get paid for transport. And there's two primary sources of that reimbursement. One is the insurance coverage, and I'll talk about a little bit deeper about that in a second. And then the other one, of course, is Medicare, Medicaid. And these days, we haven't kept up with the reimbursement rate for the cost of doing the job. So the government will give you what the government wants to give you. We know it's less than the actual cost of delivering the service. And so there is some legislative action needed, some lobbying action needed, some everybody just needs to be getting on board with that one. Of course, the insurance discussion comes back down to, we know how much we charge, the insurance knows how much they want to give us, and of course, stuck in the middle is the patient and the infamous balance bill. And whilst there's balance billing legislation occurred right now, obviously the rest of the hospital world are covered in balance billing. Air ambulances are covered in balance billing. EMS, or ground ambulance, should I say, isn't. And there's a number of reasons why we're out of that at the moment. It's because we can't demonstrate how much we cost to do in the first place. And so we have another thing going on, which of course is a cost collection survey. That's about to report out for the first year. There's 4 years worth of organizations tapped to deliver their costs. And so we can't actually change, we can't get away from the balance bill properly until we can actually say this is how much EMS costs. So we're stuck in this kind of conundrum right now. The surprise bill that they talk about, I don't talk about surprise billing. I talk about surprise payment, how much the insurance company gives you. And it's not based on any, we don't believe it's based on any science. And so we're stuck in that kind of pickle that this is how much it actually costs us to do business, because it's not just the cost of the transport of the patient, it's the cost of readiness of the system. Because we just don't come from home we're not like the volunteer lifeboat guys that will come out just when there's a ship in distress. We're there all the time. We're waiting, we're prepared, we're getting ready. And so again, it's another challenge. A number of things are happening, of course. We have next week, we have the first CMS is having a meeting next week, and I don't know when this podcast is going to go out, but in the opening week of May, CMS is having their committee to talk about balance billing. It's being chaired by Asbel Montez, who many people know, and from North Carolina. Regina Crawford is a member of that, along with other members of other sort of elements and disciplines within the EMS to discuss that. So hopefully we can maybe start to eat. And how do you eat an elephant, right?
One bite at a time. One
bite at a time. So the first bite of that particular elephant is going to be eaten and bitten in the first week of May. So fingers crossed, and good luck to the folk that have to have that discussion.
Well, and you bring up a great term within there that not a lot of people have thought about until recently, and it is that cost of readiness. We have to be, unlike some of the others, they've got staffing because they've got people in their EDs or their hospitals all the time where we may or may not have a call. We have to be prepared to deal with somebody that's having a stroke or a heart attack at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the evening, or, a bus crash or some of the other things we've seen, including, terrorist attacks and all that. The gray area of anything that we have to be prepared for is significant. And New York actually just released a paper not too long ago in their New York State evidence-based agenda of the future. That's one of the key terms that keeps coming back up is like, we're paying, you're providing a fee for service, not even providing all of what that service may be required, but you're only providing it when it happens. So that's definitely going to be good to see a lot of those conversations as they move forward and actually define what EMS is. So.
Yeah. And so just last week, so I went with Regina and we went down and met with some legislators in North Carolina on the Medicare and Medicaid expansion. So hopefully that'll improve the quality of care and the stuff that's, here in North Carolina. And so if you're one of the legislators that's helping pass that, I just want to say thank you, because I know a couple of them from our state watch our podcast.
Excellent. And I'm glad that you do watch this podcast. And of course, one of the other, not elephant, but actually one of the issues that I discussed was those 4 little words. And those 4 little words are all those in favor. You have to be friends with your legislators, whether it's the local board of supervisors, your local city council, your state government, the federal government, in order to get things done, and all those in favor, because eventually it's going to come down to a vote. And if you've done all the lobbying, if you've done all the homework, if you've presented the case, if you've got the data prepared, if you have, and dare I say, have a good story, then things will go in your favor on the day. And so that's why we're all and again, I'm kind of mixing so many points now, but we're all politicians. Whether you're the guy on the truck, you drive a massive billboard, you drive a massive advertisement for who you are and what you do. And so that also can be leveraged and parlayed into some sort of political solution. This is what we're out there doing. This is the benefit we are giving the community. This is the clinical benefit we're having on the patients. But we have an issue, and the issue is we need to be reimbursed, or, if you're a local government operation, we need more vehicles and equipment because, I have to order my truck now and I know it ain't going to be here for the next 3 years. So I need you to invest now for the delivery whenever the chips arrive and the truck arrives. So there's a lot there. And obviously politics, lobbying, legislation are absolutely key for everyone, not just people like me who spend time in Sacramento in my California life or on the Hill in my American Ambulance Association life.
So when we talk about, recruiting, retention, and we talk about reimbursement, there's another cost that I don't think a lot of people look at, but our providers have to have it, and that's for recertification. So how is that one of those elephants in the room that you talked about?
Well, we got into the education versus training discussion, and a few years ago, actually BC before COVID, we got log jammed around degrees versus education. And there was, interestingly, a very famous set of letters that went out where our fire-based colleagues were anti-degree, our EMS ambulance-based colleagues were pro-degree, and there was a massive agreement to disagree for whatever reason. And I was actually post my discussion this morning, I was chatting to educators in the room, and the discussion is around, there's a lot of medics on the truck that have degrees. I had, MPHs and PhDs on the truck that weren't necessarily in EMS, but they had advanced level education, because we haven't created and enticed our school leavers to get into a paramedic-based, degree program. Now, go across country, and I talked about the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, where they all have 4-year paramedic. In fact, Australia has a combined RN paramedic degree, so over 4 years, and it's the natural progression to go from school into that. You may not end up becoming a paramedic in the end. You might become an RN, but at least it's the sort of gateway to healthcare, and it's an appropriate degree. And so that was sort of some of the discussion that we had there. And I also mentioned the fact that in Australia right now, they are educating, every college or every university has a paramedic program. They're producing more paramedics than they have jobs for. And of course, what we're trying to do now is beat the UK. I'm sorry if you're listening in the UK, but I'm going to be an American for this one. We want to, encourage some of them to come and work with us, providing we can sort out the visa issue. And actually, there's the logjam, is getting the immigration bit sorted. But actually, there's some extra workforce that could potentially come and work with us. And they've been doing it in the UK for years. The sort of route of going walkabout to London for 3 or 4 years post degree actually gives you that resume to then go back into the Australian ambulance services, one of the 6 Australian ambulance services, and work there. So interesting discussions afoot of graduate versus training versus education, and that actually got a lot of feedback when, inevitably people will line up to talk to you afterwards. That was the discussions we were having. Actually, that was the pressure point I think I hit there.
And it's actually kind of interesting. You mentioned the internal debate about degrees. I had an interesting conversation with most of the people that were involved, including those that had published a position paper on the opposition, and they were for a degree. They love the advancement. They have a 70-page document on career progression and education. And everybody's like, well, why are you opposing this? I'm like, this is the way forward. And so it's funny that we had this conversation. Like, we could really bring all these people together, sit in a room and actually advance, because that's really what it is. Like, let's come together and discuss. And that's how advancement comes. When you take a look at some of the other places you mentioned, somebody had to sit down in a room and go, hey, this is a great idea. Let's flesh this out and move forward.
If I may plug one of the other podcasts for a second, but and hopefully you can put this in your show notes. But I've had the good fortune to recently talk to Tony Walker, who's the head of Ambulance Victoria, about how the Australian system works, and of course their graduate program, and also Steinar Olsen, who runs EMS across Norway. And again, they are a 4-year degree program, and so there's some sort of great connections there, just to listen to how the other halves live. And as I was leaving the UK 15 years ago, a graduate paramedic was the unicorn. There wasn't many of them, and they were just going into the education system. And there's no nationally funded degrees, unlike Australia, there's no nationally funded degrees there. But over the course of time, it's worked its way through the system. As I say, mum and dad are going to send junior to college to do something. Why not do a clinical, RN crossover paramedic degree? You're going to go to college anyway. Do it vocationally, and then come into the service thereafter. Just a thought.
And it opens up, those kind of conversations and those placements, especially when you look at the setup here in the States, opens up so many new opportunities in the 4-year institutions that are pushing that. Many of those institutions are R1 research institutions. So could you imagine, now taking EMS and putting it in the hopper of all these research institutions as well, the potential to grow and expand, there's a lot of options there. And we'll certainly put that in our show notes as well. So
and actually that leads me on to another elephant, which is data, and using data and numbers to tell a story. We are bad as an industry of self-promotion. We're kind of the modest, it's just our job, we do it because we love to do it. But actually we have to tell our story in order to achieve those 4 little words I was talking about earlier. And we have a ton, which I think is a technical description of a lot of data, with which we can then collect, collate, analyze, and act on. It's actually the intelligence cycle. And we need to use our numbers to tell a story, whether it's to convince a locally elected official to make a decision. One of the things I talked about in the session, and if people out there just Google NEMSIS EMS by the numbers, there is actually every week NEMSIS publish a set of charts based on the 50 million records that they have in the NEMSIS database in any 365-day period, that talk about the call volume for the national EMS system, that talk about things like, ILI related calls, whether it's cardiac arrest, gunshot wounds, etc., or trauma calls. And they publish this every week. They update it every week. And I've used it no end of times to brief officials at all sorts of levels about the various issues that we're facing. And again, we're using the numbers to tell the numbers to create the picture, in which case, a picture of the graph, the stats paint 1,000 words to help us along. And so that was one of my kind of takeaways, is to go and Google right now, the fact that we've got this information out there. You can use it and again, we have to convince our locally elected officials or nationally elected officials that we have an issue, we have a case to answer, and they need to help us solve it.
Well, and that brings up, I had a conversation with our state legislators a few years ago, and one of the things that he mentioned was, well, you all just pick up and take to the hospital. And, there was no analysis. He had no indication of what we did. And that data is part of what we need to educate those decision makers to, as you said, get that all those in favor, because when it comes down to appropriations, and we can talk about, EMS as an essential service, but if it doesn't have the appropriation behind it that gives the dollars, then a lot of this stuff goes away. So if we have the data, then you can go back and it's like, look, in your jurisdiction, we had X number of this or that, and it translates to this. And, hey, how was EMS funded, or how was EMS started?
Right.
There's a little piece of paper in the United States called accidental death and disability. And one of the key things was there was a significant amount of money being paid out to the morbidity and mortality of these patients, and they wanted to stop that. It was like, if you give us $2,000, we reduce you, X number of payouts and insurance claims, or this, that, or the other. So
actually, you just touched on another point there, that both NAEMT and AAA have legislative guides, and part of those guides also talk about how to invite somebody and host somebody in a visit or a ride along to your service. And that's vitally important, that when you go and meet these elected officials in the State House or in the in the national capital, invite them back, because they come from where you come from, because otherwise they wouldn't be your locally elected official. So invite them back to the agency for a visit where you can push the boat out, you can take them, show them what you do, and they get firsthand that knowledge of what it's like, life on the street. Interestingly, we had a thing in Sacramento a few months ago. We've had massive wall time issues, handover delay issues in California. It's been eye-wateringly bad. And so a news reporter asked to come on a ride along. So we literally put them in the supervisor vehicle, drove the supervisor vehicle to the hospital, put them on the back of the truck. There you go, you're with this crew. Where's this crew going? Nowhere. They've been here for 6 hours, and they'll probably be here for another 6. There's your report.
That's the way things change. And I'm going to use the term dog and pony. A lot of times we get, especially the federal legislators come in, and you take them through all this is what it looks like, but like, give them a shirt and toss them onto your maybe your QRV, so you can get them out to any vehicle, any call, and say, hey, ride in with the crew. I had an anesthesiology student that did a ride along with us once, and we ended up with a cardiac arrest call, and he got to help participate in that. And he's like, by the time it got done, he goes, I had no clue that you all did any of this. He goes, my opinion so far has changed. And that individual did more advocacy for EMS than his own desire to finish anesthesiology school. I mean, obviously he finished and continued, but those kind of things change people's mind.
They do. And we were on the Hill in Washington, D.C. a few days ago for EMT on the Hill, and one of the state delegates was talking to someone who's on one of the health committees, and they had the aha moment when I'm leaving here and going to catch Secretary Becerra and get them on the case, because I hadn't realized it was this dire. So if you have to talk to these people, invite them along and get them involved, and state your case.
So we've talked about reimbursement. We've talked about recruiting, retention, recertification. One of the other elephants that you mentioned today was contracting.
Right.
So let's talk a little about contracting.
Yeah. Now, in many places in the country, of course, the local certificate of need or the exclusive operating area is essentially bid out. And a lot of local authorities will describe what they want to see in their EMS system. They'll identify usually response time standards. They'll identify targets. They'll identify penalties, charges, whatever, fines, whatever you want to call them. And initially, they will describe this almost utopian system that when you start to put pounds, shillings, and pence, or dollars and cents, depending on where you're listening from, onto that, it becomes an expensive proposition to deliver what they want. And so my point today was they describe the cruise liner when they can only afford the rowboat, because the system and its payer mix can't sustain, unless they're going to heavily subsidize the system, can't sustain what they want. And so when you get into these kind of private ambulance companies, particularly bidding for delivery of the system, there is almost this sort of perversity where they're going to have to outbid each other by underbidding, and eventually you have a service that may not be able to be delivered because of the cost of doing business. The other thing that I noted is that in some RFPs there is fees that the successful bidder has to pay the locality. For example, each fire truck has to have new monitors. The whole office of EMS of that particular area has its salary paid for by income from the winning bidder. And so there is almost this kind of pay to play, which is a perversity. And so that was kind of one of the things that I raised, that we need to stop doing that. You just need to sort of Google where systems are failing. You will see that there is all sorts of realizations, if you like, that this actually does cost a lot of money to run an EMS system. And just by taking it back, or by finding that the incumbent ambulance company isn't actually solving anything. And so we have a lot of fixing or unfixing, depending which side of the table you're sitting on, to do around contracting ambulance service to deliver a service that we know is unaffordable based on what you've described. And so therein lies that particular challenge.
So contracting, reimbursement, all this, and we've talked a little bit about it, but let's talk just a little bit more about politics and why people should speak to the politicians and have stuff ready.
I now do this pretty much for a living, 50% of my time, whether it's state politics or national politics with either CAA or AAA. But we put these people into office, simple as that. All right. They are there representing, doing our business. And so we're their constituents. And so we have that kind of, particularly when you show up in uniform, please show up in uniform. You have that kind of hometown advantage when you're trying to legislate for change. We want North Carolina, it's in a lot of stuff in the news around the creation of a thriving wage or a living wage. And it's actually, I think, in North Carolina that rising tide has lifted all ships, because if one county is paying more, the other county isn't. I'm just going to move and change over. And so to actually lobby the local authority, whatever that authority is, to increase salary and living wage for the workers means that you're not going to be losing people all the time, because the next door county isn't paying more than the current county. So that's the reason to get involved. We've got a lot of change coming up. We have, we talked about balance billing. We talked about cost collections. We talked about things like, if you're dealing with VA and the payments that are going on there, that's an income challenge for EMS. So we talked about, extension of line of duty death benefits, for example. That requires funding. It requires legislation. It requires attention. So there's a lot of the add-ons, in other words, the rural, if you're in a rural and a super rural area, that those payments go away periodically because they're just on a sort of a 5-year cycle. And I remember we got the add-ons added back in a few years ago. Oh, that's it. Well, no, we've got to keep going because it's going to run out again. So there's lots of politics and politicking, and actually it's not just preserved for government affairs consultants. Actually, the more medics you stick in front of your locally elected officials, the better, because they are the ones that can tell the story. California right now, we're going through a political campaign to increase our Medi-Cal funding. And the people that we're getting to tell those stories are A, the medics, and B, labor unions. And we are totally in lockstep with all of our labor colleagues, because we want to be able to pay our people better, which is, of course, what our labor colleagues want. But unless we work together on getting the government or the local government to change their current rates, their current fiscal settings, we're not going to achieve anything. And so therefore it takes all sorts to get this done. Interestingly, I talked about a number of national associations. Prior to COVID, for example, we had fire-based organizations, ambulance-based organizations that generally didn't have the same agendas. But of course, we realized that some of these big ticket items, particularly around governmental Medicare, Medicaid funding, etc., everybody is now working together and in lockstep. We had a meeting of the minds where we said, okay, let's agree on what we don't agree on and park it. Now we've got things left that we do agree on. Let's all hunt as a pack and get this done. And so the last EMS on the Hill, NAEMT's EMS on the Hill, the opening speaker was from IFF. The next speaker was from AAA, and then NAEMT came in, because that just demonstrated the unity. And of course, when you go into those and when you go and see these elected officials, they're like, well, we had this EMS organization and that EMS organization and that fire organization. You've been here for weeks. Why don't you just all come together? Well, guess what? We're here together this time. And of course, that has some traction.
And, going on to that, some of these individuals that have never been on the side of being an advocate for the profession is like, well, why me as a ground level paramedic or an EMT? And the answer to that is, if they see one of you, it's good for them to just, okay, it's one of them. If it's 10 of you, it's like, well, okay, But if it's 100 of you that are coming to see them, then all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, I can't just push this away. It's, so it becomes this larger aspect. Now, you've mentioned a couple of them, and I, trying to get that entry into advocacy, I think it's really important for people to know that it's not necessarily going to your state capital or the federal capital. That is a big thing as well. But utilizing things like the NAEMT's online legislative service, you just have to go on there, put in your information, and it automatically sends it to them. Or you can do the stuff like AAA, participate through AAA, or your state EMS service. And it may come down to just making a phone call. You're good to hang out at home, and you call and talk to the federal legislative staff, or your state legislators, or even just your local representatives. Like, that can make a difference. Just making phone calls like, hey, you have this bill, the Medicare extenders. Just a couple of years ago, as that was going through, hey, what does this mean to you? Well, I'm in a super rural area. That's a rather large add-on, and that just keeps gas in our tank. And I think is a big thing. So anybody can participate, again, just from going to some like NAEMT or making a phone call or an email.
Yeah, and from a campaign perspective, of course, in California, we have the same program where you put your name, your address, and then that targets your locally elected official and then sends the campaign letter of the day or of the week. But also we've become ruthless at using social media, and everything from who'd have thought I'd have a TikTok channel, but I do, right? And so but we have every type of channel you can imagine, and actually we channel our adverts, which we create sort of content, and that then gets channeled into the zip code of the particular chair of the particular committee we're seeking to influence. And so if he puts his Facebook page on, all he's getting is CAA medics on the screen talking about one great guy gave us this great soundbite that he's one missed shift away from the poverty line, which is criminal. It's awful, but in some cases that's the way it is. And so we had a lot of these sort of discussions with folk, and I did some podcasting. I call it an EMS town hall, where instead of having the muckety mucks like me and others on the podcast, I had a room full of EMTs, and we had a heart to heart, and it really all came out about the fact is that yes, they love doing what they do. They do it. This is a calling. This is not a job. It's a way of life. But actually, I can't afford to do it. And I know that Wendy's has more, I can make more as the Walmart greeter, sorry, Walmart, but that you can, or Wendy's or Target or whatever. And I get off on time, and I don't have to deal with some of the trauma. Well, we do two things, trauma and drama. I have to deal with both those things, right? So I'm off. And so, we have we've got a very, very powerful campaign going, and fingers crossed that it will continue to progress, because of course politics is like, in England we call it snakes and ladders. What's the American name for that? It's not, you don't have when you the board game, what's it called?
Shoots and ladders.
Shoots. Well, in England it's snakes and ladders, right? So it's one of those ones where the campaign's going and going and going and going, and then whoops, we're down the chute again, right? And so that's probably a great assessment of politics. But you've got to keep in the game. You've got to keep rolling the dice, and you've got to try and get to the end of the game by getting up the ladders and not, as you'd say, down the chutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So talking with politics, just look at it this way. If you're an EMS administration, or if you're a field provider, get involved. If not you, then who? Because they want to hear from the people in the streets as much as they do from the administrators.
Well, and I want to. We've already mentioned it once here, talking about the firefighters associations and their impact. And we can go to our brethren on the law enforcement side, and everybody talks about what they do. Or that they always get what they want. It's kind of the terminology that some people use to just and that's because they have done this for a long time, and they have done it well. And they have, when a FOP local is opposed to something, they pick up a call or a phone. I need 50 of you all at this address in half an hour. And guess what they do? They all out there, they're all doing this. I go back to one of my favorite television shows, The West Wing, and I want to use California as an example. And they're like, why are we going out to talk to this local president? And he's like, nobody gets elected in California without this guy. At a moment's notice, he can make a phone call and have 10,000 people at your rally, either for you or against you. And, and that's kind of what this is it's a grassroots campaign. The more of us that we have involved, the bigger voice you have. You go to a football stadium, high school football stadium with 500 people there cheering from their team. You hear them. You go to the University of Tennessee, best football stadium in the world, on a game day Saturday, and you've got actually Richter scales going off because of the noise when they beat Alabama. And because you have 102,000 people sitting there. So the more voices you have, the better.
Well, let me take you from the fantasy that is the West Wing to the reality that is actually California. And a shout out to our colleagues in NAGE, SEIU, TEMSA, AFSME, actually United Steel Workers, and even the Teamsters, who are also run EMS unions around California. We couldn't do it without them, without their support. And the fact that our legislation is labor friendly, and we are in absolute lockstep with those people, and we couldn't get. And again, I come back to all those in favour, right? You've got to count the votes before the vote is taken. And actually, our colleagues in Labour right now are helping us get those votes counted.
So, as we move forward and we look at this, you made a very good point this morning, and you compared us to something that most people are familiar with. We no longer need to act like who?
Well, my final point really was talking about all these issues, and obviously offering some solutions. But sometimes the EMS is the great health and social care safety net, right? We're the good guys. We're like the UN. We're all about keeping the peace. But actually, to get stuff done, we have to stop thinking that we're the UN, and we have to start thinking like NATO, because NATO is an attack on one, is an attack on all. So we have to start changing our mindset a little bit. Right now, we can go back to being the UN eventually, but right now we have to actually repel all borders, and those borders are folk that are trying to either defund us, folk that are trying to deny us funds. And so that's the mindset now. We need to get together. We need to create that, North Atlantic, North EMS Treaty Organization, and go forward and, be successful. So that was my UN NATO analogy, and clearly it had some effect on you.
I thought it was a perfect way to describe what we need to do.
There we go. And that was how we ended.
So with this, Rob has given us a tremendous amount of his presentation, but I think it would still be a good idea, if you want to hear all this, make sure and reach out to him, and he'll come to your conference and present it as well, even though he gave out a lot of his secrets here today as well. So Rob, as we wrap up, we always like to give you an opportunity for 2 to 3 minute wrap up, and just anything that is outstanding in your mind that we should know. Your time is yours.
Well, I was invited here to be the keynote, and by the way, I had to follow the legend that is Ken Bouvier, who normally entertains, edutains, and amuses, and so then I come in with the sort of the tough subject of here are the issues we need to deal with. But we have some challenges in EMS. We must remember that our people are our most important thing. And actually, I'm going to touch on one of the things we didn't talk about, and that's talk about the Peter principle, right? We always in EMS get the best medic, the best paramedic who's performing on the truck, and promote them to a level of incompetence initially, as in you're the great medic and now you're the supervisor, and I haven't trained you to do that, but I expect you to do it. And so we have to think about how we look after our people by training them internally for the next job, for the next position. Sometimes organizations are reluctant to do that because we may train them and they may leave. Well, actually try training them and they may well stay. And so look after your people, train your people, educate your people. And then I put up another chart, actually, which I may share with you, of looking at how we talk about EMS 2050, right? So this is the great paper that CMS put out talking about where we're going to be at 2050. My contention is we probably would have paved paradise and put up a parking lot by then, by the way. But the point being is the age of the people in the room, half of them aren't going to get to 2050. So I'm looking at you, the 20 to 30-year-olds, because you are the future of EMS. You're the ones that are going to carry us forward into, the next 20, 30 years. And what we mustn't do is lose you. We have to train you, educate you, nurture you, and prepare you to be the leaders of the future. And if we don't do that, then we just end up going back through that revolving door again. And so it's quite simply, it's one of those look after your people, look after yourself and each other moments. And I guess that's really what I came to North Carolina to say.
Well, I think you pretty much said it, but anytime I hear that, I go back to Richard Branson's quote or conversation between him and his CFO, and his CFO goes, "What happens if we train these people and they leave?" And he goes, "What happens if we don't and they stay?" And I think that's, you invest in your people, and I think the best, you take care of your people, they take care of everything else. So I absolutely love that point. Any last points from you, Bradley?
No, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for coming to North Carolina. And you will actually be on the podcast, and Ken Bouvier will be following you.
Well, that's a first. Over the years of doing this on the national stage, I've always followed Ken, and I've always gone, "Oh my God, I'm following Ken." So there you go, Ken, follow this.
All right. So as we conclude today, we like to say we always look forward to hearing your feedback. So don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Also go and visit the EMS1 podcast and the voice of Rob there, and NAEMT podcast as well. So he's in many different areas. We'd like to thank our guest for being here today. But until next week, remember the value of your EMS handoff.